The streets of Manhattan were unusually quiet as I pulled up to the address scribbled hastily on a wrinkled sheet of paper. It was 2005, and I was working as a delivery driver for one of those high-end catering companies that service the elite of New York City. Most nights were routine. Luxurious brownstone drop-offs, garbled thank yous through intercoms, or the occasional run-in with a drunk socialite stumbling out of a party too early. But nothing could have prepared me for the nights when my deliveries took me to the world of Sean Diddy Combs' infamous parties. What I saw there haunts me to this day. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The first time I delivered to one of Diddy's events, I didn't even realize where I was. The location was a swanky penthouse on the Upper East Side, towering over the city like a jewel-encrusted crown. The elevator ride felt endless, the kind that makes your stomach flip with every passing floor. When the doors opened, I stepped into a world so extravagant that it barely seemed real. The hallway alone was lit with flickering candles in crystal holders, their soft glow casting elongated shadows on walls lined with expensive art. I could hear the music thumping faintly behind the double doors at the end of the hall, a bass line so deep it felt like the floor beneath my feet was alive. I knocked once, then twice. A man dressed head to toe in black, looking more like a Secret Service agent than a doorman, opened the door just wide enough to pull me inside. My first impression was of sheer chaos. The room was awash in gold light, the air heavy with the mingling scents of cigar smoke, expensive perfume, and something sweet yet bitter I couldn't quite place. I barely had time to take it all in before I was directed toward the kitchen to unload the trays of hors d'oeuvres. That's when I first saw them, the people. They weren't just guests, they were performers, actors in a surreal play that I had inadvertently become a part of. The women floated through the space like they were gliding, wearing dresses that clung to their bodies like liquid metal. Their laughter was sharp, almost cruel, as if they were mocking the very world that adored them. The men, many of them celebrities I recognized but didn't dare approach, were draped in custom suits and dripping with diamonds. Yet there was something in their eyes, something hollow. I overheard fragments of conversations as I moved through the room with my trays, trying to stay unnoticed. Some of it was mundane, talk of record deals and fashion lines, but then there were whispers of things that made my stomach churn. A woman leaned into a man's ear, her hand brushing the diamond chain on his neck, and said something about the room downstairs. His laugh was cold, but his eyes flicked toward the back of the penthouse where a discreet staircase spiraled downward. I didn't know what was down there, but I felt the weight of it, like the air grew heavier just thinking about it. I started getting more assignments for Diddy's parties. Word had spread among the catering staff that I was discreet, didn't ask questions, and could navigate a crowd without drawing attention to myself. Each time the scenes grew darker. One party was held in a sprawling mansion in the Hamptons, its grounds so expansive I had to be escorted by golf cart from the gate to the main house. The partygoers were drunk on excess, their behavior teetering on the edge of the grotesque. At one point I wandered outside to catch my breath and found myself near the pool. The water shimmered under the light of 1,000 stringed bulbs, but it was what floated in it that stopped me cold. There were bodies, dozens of them, writhing and entwined. At first I thought it was some kind of performance art, but the longer I watched, the more I realized there was nothing staged about it. Their movements were frantic, desperate, like people trying to claw their way out of a nightmare. A man in a white suit noticed me staring and approached, his grin wide and unblinking. "You've seen too much," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. I stumbled back into the house, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time I reached my 4th or 5th party, the nightmares were no longer confined to sleep. They followed me into my waking life, bleeding into the edges of my vision like shadows that didn't belong. I'd see flashes of things, distorted faces, blood-red lights, or the faint outline of that staircase leading downward. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was alone. The worst of it came at a party in Tribeca. The theme was heaven and hell, and the decor was appropriately nightmarish. Half the room was decked out in ethereal white, with clouds of dry ice wafting through the air, and angels carved from ice stationed at every corner. The other half was drenched in red, lit by flickering flames and candelabras that looked like they belonged in a medieval torture chamber. The contrast was unsettling, to say the least. As I moved through the crowd, delivering trays of lobster tails and truffle sliders, I noticed a pattern. People were gravitating toward the hell side of the room. I could hear muffled screams coming from somewhere, though I couldn't pinpoint their source. At one point, I passed a hallway and saw a man being dragged into a room by 2 women. His eyes met mine for a brief second, and I swear I saw pure terror in them. Before I could process what I'd seen, the door slammed shut, and the hallway was empty again. Later that night, I overheard one of the catering staff whispering to another about the ritual. They didn't elaborate, but their faces were pale, their hands trembling as they passed a tray of champagne flutes between them. I wanted to ask, but fear held my tongue. I finished my shift in silence and left as quickly as I could. The nightmares escalated after that. I'd wake up in the middle of the night gasping for air, my sheets soaked with sweat. The dreams always started the same. I was back at one of the parties, standing at the top of that staircase. The music would fade, replaced by a low, guttural chanting that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Then, as I took the first step down, the world would shift. The air grew thicker, the shadows darker, and I'd feel hands, cold, skeletal hands, reaching for me from the darkness. I always woke up before I reached the bottom, but the fear lingered long after I opened my eyes. I tried to quit the catering company, but they convinced me to stay. The money was too good, and I was too broke to walk away. Still, I started refusing assignments for any event associated with Diddy. It didn't matter. The nightmares persisted, and the sense of dread that followed me everywhere became unbearable. One day, I ran into a former coworker who had also worked some of those parties. We grabbed coffee, and after a few minutes of awkward small talk, I finally asked, "Did you ever see anything strange at those events?" His face went pale, and he looked around the cafe as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Then he leaned in close and said, "Whatever you think you saw, forget it. Just forget it. Some things aren't meant to be understood." I never delivered to another party after that. I left the catering business entirely and tried to rebuild my life, but the memories still haunt me. Even now, almost 2 decades later, I can't walk past a penthouse or hear a bass line thumping in the distance without feeling a chill run down my spine. What I saw at those parties, the excess, the debauchery, the whispers of something far darker, changed me. I don't know if it was real or just the imagination of a young man thrust into a world he couldn't comprehend, but some nights when I close my eyes, I hear that chanting again, and I'm standing at the top of the staircase staring into the abyss. After leaving the catering business, I thought the nightmares and the suffocating paranoia would slowly fade away. I believed that time and distance could put those memories to rest, but I underestimated just how deeply those experiences had carved themselves into me. No matter how hard I tried to forget, the echoes of those nights found ways to resurface, dragging me back into a world I no longer belonged to, but could never fully escape. The turning point came a few years later, in 2009. By then, I had moved out of the city, hoping that the slower pace of a small town upstate would offer some semblance of peace. I had a stable job, a modest apartment, and a routine that kept me grounded. Yet every so often, I'd catch something. A phrase in a song, a flash of gold in a stranger's jewelry, or the way candlelight flickered at a dinner party that sent me spiraling back to those nights. It wasn't just the memories of the decadence or the grotesque displays of wealth. It was the knowledge that there had been something more sinister lurking beneath it all. One night, as I was scrolling aimlessly through social media, I stumbled across a headline that made my chest tighten. Former assistant to major hip-hop mogul reveals disturbing party secrets. The article was buried under layers of celebrity gossip and tabloid fodder, but the words disturbing and secrets leapt out at me. Against my better judgment, I clicked. The piece was a half-baked exposé written by someone claiming to have worked closely with Diddy during the early 2000s. They didn't name names outright, but the descriptions of the parties were unmistakable. The extravagant themes, the cryptic whispers about hidden rooms, and the unsettling behaviors of the guests. My stomach churned as I read the details. The article spoke of bizarre rituals, unspoken rules, and a pervasive sense that everyone present was complicit in something far darker than mere hedonism. What truly unnerved me was a mention of the downstairs rooms. According to the article, these spaces weren't just for exclusivity, they were places where the boundaries of morality and humanity blurred. The writer hinted at things they had seen but refused to describe outright, claiming that doing so could endanger them. A line near the end of the article stuck with me. "Once you've seen what happens behind those doors, you're never the same." I slammed my laptop shut and tried to convince myself it was just a sensationalized story. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Those glimpses of the staircase, the whispers, and the fear in that man's eyes at the Tribeca party, everything began to connect in ways I didn't want to understand. The article wasn't telling me anything new. It was merely confirming what I had been too scared to admit. A week later, I received an unexpected phone call from an old coworker, Tony. He had been a delivery driver too, though we'd only crossed paths a few times. His voice was shaky, almost desperate. "Man, "I don't know who else to talk to," he said. "I know you were at those parties too. Tell me I'm not crazy." Tony explained that he'd been having similar nightmares. Visions of shadowy figures in hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. He had recently started seeing things in his waking life. Flashes of faces in mirrors, fleeting movements in his peripheral vision, and even a voice that occasionally whispered his name when he was alone. "It's like something followed me home," he said, his voice cracking. "I can't shake it." We decided to meet in person at a diner halfway between my town and the city. When we sat down, I could see the toll it had taken on him. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands trembled as he held his coffee, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear behind him. "I keep thinking about the staircase," he said, barely above a whisper. "You know the one. I never went down, but I swear I could hear things." His eyes darted to mine, pleading for confirmation. "Did you hear them too?" I nodded, feeling a cold weight settle in my chest. "I heard it, and I saw things too. Things that didn't make sense." We spent hours comparing stories, piecing together fragments of memories that neither of us wanted to face alone. Tony revealed something I hadn't known. One night, after most of the catering staff had left a party in Soho, he had been asked to stay behind to help clean up. As he was gathering glasses near the back of the penthouse, he noticed a man slip into the hallway leading to the staircase. Curious, Tony had followed at a distance, his heart pounding. The man descended the stairs and Tony, unable to resist, crept closer. "I didn't go all the way down," he said, his voice trembling, "but I saw the door at the bottom. It was black, like unnaturally black, and there was this symbol on it, like an eye, but not exactly. I could feel it staring at me, even from the top of the stairs. I turned and ran before anyone could see me." Hearing his story only deepened my own unease. I had always wondered what was at the bottom of those stairs, but now I was certain I didn't want to know. Whatever was down there, it wasn't meant for people like us to see. Over the next few months, Tony and I stayed in touch, sharing updates on our lives and the strange occurrences that continued to plague us. He tried therapy, but his therapist dismissed his experiences as stress-induced hallucinations. I suggested moving away, but Tony insisted it wouldn't help. "You can't outrun something like this," he said. "It's inside us now." Then one day, Tony stopped responding. His phone went straight to voicemail, and my texts went unanswered. I reached out to mutual acquaintances, but no one had heard from him. A sinking feeling settled in my gut, but I tried to convince myself that he had simply decided to cut ties and move on. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I learned the truth. Tony had been found dead in his apartment. The official cause was an overdose, but the circumstances were strange. According to the police report, his apartment had been in disarray. Furniture overturned, mirrors shattered, and bizarre symbols scrawled on the walls in what appeared to be his own blood. The report didn't speculate on what had driven him to such a state, but I didn't need an explanation. I knew. After Tony's death, the nightmares intensified. They no longer started with the staircase. Instead, I was already at the bottom, standing in front of that black door. The symbol Tony described was there, pulsating like a heartbeat. The chanting was louder now, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out the words. My dreams always ended the same way. The door would begin to creak open, and I'd wake up screaming before I could see what lay beyond. I became obsessed with understanding what had happened at those parties. I scoured the internet for any clues, revisiting old rumors and conspiracy theories about the music industry's dark underbelly. Most of it was nonsense, wild claims about secret societies and satanic rituals, but there were occasional threads that felt too close to the truth to ignore. I read about initiations, sacrifices, and the idea that some of these parties weren't just celebrations, but something far more deliberate. The phrase energy exchange kept coming up, though its meaning was always vague. One night, as I was sifting through an obscure forum, I came across a post from someone claiming to have worked security at high-profile events in the early 2000s. The post described an event eerily similar to the Tribeca party I had attended, complete with the heaven and hell theme. The poster mentioned seeing guests being escorted to a private area, after which they would return visibly shaken or unusually elated. The final line of the post sent a shiver down my spine. Whatever they're doing in those rooms, it's not for us to understand, but it changes people. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. I tried reaching out to the poster, but the account had been deactivated. Frustrated and desperate for answers, I decided to take a risk. I reached out to one of the catering managers I had worked under, a woman named Denise. She had been the one assigning me to those parties, and I hoped she might know more than she let on. When I called her, Denise was hesitant to talk. She claimed not to remember much, brushing off my questions with curt responses, but as I pressed her, her tone shifted. "Look," she said finally, her voice low, There are things you don't want to know about those parties. I've seen people get too curious, and it never ends well. Before I could respond, she hung up. That night, I had the worst dream yet. This time, the black door didn't just open, it pulled me inside. The air was thick and suffocating, and I was surrounded by figures cloaked in shadows. Their chanting filled my ears, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. In the center of the room stood a figure unlike any I'd ever seen, tall, faceless, and radiating an aura of pure malevolence. It reached out to me, its hand stretching impossibly long, and I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding as if I'd just escaped a predator. In the days following that dream, I started noticing more anomalies in my waking life. My reflection in the mirror seemed wrong. It wasn't just a trick of the light or a fleeting shadow. My face looked subtly different, as if someone else was wearing it. The edges of my reflection didn't quite align with the real me, and the eyes staring back seemed older, wearier, almost accusatory. At first, I chalked it up to stress and sleep deprivation, but as the days turned into weeks, the feeling that something was watching me became impossible to ignore. Then, there were the noises. They started faintly, a soft whisper that I couldn't quite catch, like the remnants of a conversation drifting through the walls. I'd hear them most often late at night, when the world outside was silent. At first, I thought they were coming from the neighbors, but the voices weren't muffled like normal sounds would be. They were too close, too clear, as if they were coming from inside the room. Sometimes the whispers grew louder, almost like chanting. It was always the same rhythm, a cadence that made my skin crawl. One night, the whispers turned into a scream. I was jolted awake, heart pounding, convinced someone was in the room with me. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and swung it wildly at the darkness. But there was no one there, just the suffocating silence that always seemed to follow these episodes. I sat on the edge of my bed, shaking, and stared at the mirror across the room. For a split second, I saw movement in the reflection, something darting just out of frame. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, it was just my own face staring back, though the eyes seemed amused. The breaking point came one afternoon when I received a package I hadn't ordered. It was a plain brown box, unmarked except for my name and address scrawled in blocky handwriting. I hesitated before opening it, every instinct telling me to throw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single item, a small black notebook with no title or markings on the cover. I flipped through it, and my blood ran cold. The pages were filled with detailed descriptions of the parties I had attended, names of guests, layouts of the rooms, even notes on what the catering staff was wearing. But it went further than that. There were details I couldn't possibly have known, conversations I hadn't overheard, events that had taken place in rooms I'd never entered. The writing was fragmented, almost manic, as if the author had been in a state of delirium. Scattered throughout were crude sketches of the black door, the eye-like symbol, and other shapes I couldn't decipher but that filled me with dread. The next day, I decided to visit Denise. I had tried to let it go after our last conversation, but the notebook had reignited my desperation for answers. She lived in Queens, in a modest house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. When I arrived, her face fell the moment she saw me. It wasn't just surprise, it was fear. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low and urgent. She glanced over my shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching. "They don't like it when you ask questions." "Who?" I demanded, stepping inside before she could close the door. "Who are they, Denise? What's happening to me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she poured herself a glass of whiskey and downed it in one gulp. "You don't get it, do you?" she said finally. "Those parties weren't just for fun. They were transactions. People came there to make deals, to gain power, fame, fortune, but nothing comes for free." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What kind of deals?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "The kind that cost more than you realize," she said, her eyes distant. "Most of them knew what they were getting into, but some didn't. People like us, the staff, we were just collateral, extras in their twisted little game. But sometimes the wrong people see too much, and once you've seen it, you're marked." I thought about Tony, about the notebook, about the nightmares that had become my constant companions. "Is there a way to stop it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Denise shook her head. "You can't stop it. The best you can do is stay quiet, keep your head down, and hope they lose interest." I left her house feeling more helpless than ever. Her warning echoed in my mind. Stay quiet, keep your head down. But how could I? The things I had experienced weren't just memories. They were alive, clawing at me, dragging me deeper into a darkness I couldn't escape. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and frayed nerves. I avoided mirrors, kept every light in my apartment on, and jumped at every unexpected sound. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, until they were impossible to ignore. They weren't just random noises anymore, they were saying my name. One night I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled the black notebook from the drawer where I had hidden it and flipped through the pages, desperate for some kind of clue. My hands shook as I reached the final page, where the words "You were chosen" stared back at me. Beneath them, in tiny, almost imperceptible handwriting, was an address. I didn't recognize it, but something compelled me to go. It was as if an invisible hand was guiding me, pushing me towards something I didn't understand but couldn't resist. The address led me to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The building loomed over me, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. I hesitated at the entrance, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but the whispers were louder now, urging me forward. Inside, the air was cold and stale, heavy with the scent of decay. The floor was littered with debris, and the only light came from a faint, flickering bulb hanging in the center of the room. As I stepped deeper into the space, I saw it, the black door. It was exactly as I had seen it in my dreams, its surface impossibly dark and the eye-like symbol glowing faintly in the dim light. My heart raced as I approached, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The chanting started again, low and guttural, filling the space around me. My hands trembled as I reached for the door, every fiber of my being telling me to stop. But I couldn't. When I pushed the door open, the world seemed to shift. The air grew thicker, the chanting louder and the shadows deeper. I stepped inside and found myself in a cavernous space that defied logic. The walls were lined with mirrors, each reflecting not my own image but scenes from the parties I had attended. Only they were distorted, darker, and filled with things I hadn't noticed before. Figures moved in the background, their faces obscured, their movements unnatural. In the center of the room stood the figure from my dreams. It was taller than I had imagined, its faceless head tilting as if acknowledging my presence. It raised a hand, and the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening. "You've come," it said, its voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "You were chosen." "For what?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. "To witness," it replied, "and to remember." Before I could respond, the mirrors shattered and the world went black. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, the black notebook lying open beside me. The final page was blank, the words "You were chosen" gone. The nightmares have stopped since that night, but the memories remain, sharper and more vivid than ever. I don't know what I witnessed or why I was chosen, but one thing is certain, I'll never be the same. The weeks following that final experience were disorienting in ways I couldn't have anticipated. On the surface, my life seemed normal again. The whispers stopped, the nightmares ceased, and the suffocating dread that had become my constant companion lifted. Yet, in the stillness of those quiet nights, I couldn't help but feel the absence of something, like the echo of a sound that had once been deafening. It wasn't relief that I felt, it was a hollow unease. The events of that night in the warehouse replayed in my mind like a fragmented film reel, broken and incomplete. What I had seen, or thought I'd seen, lingered at the edge of my consciousness, teasing me with glimpses of something I couldn't fully grasp. The figure's words, "to witness and to remember," were a riddle I turned over endlessly. Witness what? Remember for whom? For what purpose? I began noticing subtle changes in myself. My senses felt heightened, sharper than before. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more layered, and I found myself noticing details I would have overlooked in the past. A casual glance at a crowd on the subway would reveal things I couldn't explain. The tension in a stranger's jaw, the flicker of fear in someone's eyes, or the unspoken secrets they carried in their posture. It was as though I could see beneath the surface of things, as though the veil that separated the mundane from the extraordinary had been permanently lifted. Then there were the people. Strangers began approaching me with unnerving regularity, their eyes wide and desperate as they murmured cryptic phrases. "You've seen it, haven't you?" one man whispered as I passed him on a busy street. Another grabbed my arm outside a coffee shop, his grip firm and his gaze piercing. "They marked you. Be careful." These encounters left me shaken, but the most unsettling part was that they seemed to recognize something in me, something I wasn't even sure I understood myself. One night, I found myself back at the warehouse, drawn there by a pull I couldn't resist. The building was as decrepit as before, but the black door was gone. In its place was an expanse of smooth concrete, as though the door had never existed. I stood there for hours, staring at the spot where it had been, hoping for some kind of sign, but nothing came. As I turned to leave, I felt a familiar sensation, a weightless electric hum in the air. I turned back, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the faint outline of the door, shimmering like a mirage before disappearing entirely. I left that night feeling both relieved and unnerved, as though the door's absence was a warning rather than a reprieve. Now, years later, the memories remain vivid, but the urgency has faded. I still sense things others can't, and I've learned to live with the whispers of a world that most people will never see. But every so often, when I close my eyes, I hear the faint echo of that chant, feel the pull of that black door, and wonder if my role as a witness is truly over, or if I'm still waiting for the final act. There are days when I can almost convince myself that it's all behind me, that the darkness I witnessed in those moments of twisted glamour is a distant memory. I try to lead a normal life, one where I can walk down the street without feeling like someone's watching, where I can sit in a room without the air thickening, without the oppressive sense that there's something just out of sight. But no matter how hard I try, the scars remain, etched deep into my mind. The people, the places, the things I've seen, they linger, not like shadows, but like a second skin, ever present, never truly leaving. I often find myself retracing my steps, trying to piece together what happened. It's a dangerous game, but one I can't seem to resist. I've tried to reach out to others who were once part of those worlds, the caterers, the assistants, the security staff. But most of them have moved on. Or at least, that's what they tell me when I reach them. Those who do answer avoid talking in any real detail, speaking in hushed tones, as if the very mention of those parties or those places might be enough to draw unwanted attention. They've learned, just like I have, that some things are better left unsaid. Every now and then I get a strange message, always from an anonymous number. The text will simply read, "They never forget you." It's chilling, knowing that whoever is sending these messages is aware of me in ways that seem impossible. They know what I've seen, and they know what I can never unsee. I've considered changing my number, changing my identity entirely, but I don't think it would make a difference. Whatever it is that's been set in motion, whatever force has taken an interest in me, it's too powerful to escape. I can't help but feel as though I've been marked, chosen not by my own will, but by some invisible hand pulling me deeper into this web I never asked to be a part of. The feeling of being observed never leaves me. I catch glimpses of faces in crowds, eyes that seem too intent on me, too aware of my presence. Sometimes I can hear whispers in the wind, or in the murmur of a crowd, and I know that they're speaking about me, about what I've seen, about what I'll never forget. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the hidden secrets of Diddy parties in 2005? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.